Desperation fills the streets of Gaza. Picture yourself standing in a crowd, every muscle tense, every sense sharpened by hunger and fear, just for the chance to secure a handful of flour or a tin of beans for your children. This scene is not a relic of the distant past or a nightmare from dystopian fiction. It is the harsh, daily reality for families in the Gaza Strip right now. On a recent day that will be remembered for generations, hundreds of civilians massed along a battered road in Khan Younis, their hopes pinned on the distant rumble of aid trucks. For these families, those trucks meant the difference between life and death, a fleeting hope for bread, pulses, or even a piece of fruit to stave off starvation. But hope quickly dissolved into horror. In a matter of minutes, Israeli tanks fired shells into the crowd. The aftermath was unspeakable. More than 50 civilians, including children and the elderly, lost their lives. Hundreds more were wounded, many with injuries so severe that local hospitals, already overwhelmed and undersupplied, could do little to help. The city, already battered by months of relentless violence, descended further into chaos and despair, as families searched desperately for missing loved ones among the ruins. How did a queue for food become a front line in one of the world's most intractable conflicts? Where did the humanitarian system designed to preserve life go so horribly wrong? The world has watched in horror as images from Gaza have flooded social media, families clutching each other amid rubble, children clinging to sacks of flour almost as big as themselves, the bodies of men, women, and children lying lifeless on dusty roads. These are not isolated moments. They are the culmination of a crisis decades in the making, intensified by months of war and years of deprivation. Each heartbreaking image is one chapter in a much larger story. To deeply understand the hunger crisis now gripping Gaza, we must widen our lens. The Gaza Strip, a narrow coastal enclave, is home to roughly 2,300,000 people. For nearly 2 decades, Gaza's borders have been tightly controlled. The blockade, imposed after Hamas assumed power in the year 2007, has restricted the movement of goods, people, fuel, and essential medicines. This blockade has shaped every aspect of daily life in Gaza, from the food on the table to the education children can receive. Following the violence of October in the year 2023, restrictions tightened dramatically. On the 7th of that month, Hamas militants crossed into southern Israel, killing over 1,200 Israelis and taking 251 hostages. Israel's response was immediate and overwhelming. Airstrikes pounded Gaza, leveling entire neighborhoods. A ground invasion soon followed, and the death toll has since climbed to nearly 55,000 Palestinians, according to local health authorities. The vast majority of Gaza's residents, almost the entire population of 2,300,000, have been forced from their homes, many more than once, seeking shelter in makeshift camps, schools, and even the ruins of destroyed buildings. Hospitals, schools, and even United Nations shelters, places once considered safe, have been hit. Survival now means facing not just the threat of bombs and gunfire, but also the daily struggle to find food, water, and medicine. The most basic acts, fetching water, queuing for bread, seeking medical care, can be deadly. International law is supposed to offer protection, even in the chaos of war. The Fourth Geneva Convention, established after the horrors of the Second World War, sets forth clear rules. Occupying powers must protect civilian populations, guarantee access to humanitarian aid, and minimize harm to innocents. Yet, in Gaza, these principles are under unprecedented strain. United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has condemned the recent attacks in the strongest terms, insisting that those responsible must be held accountable. Human Rights Watch's Omar Shakir has raised serious concerns about violations of international humanitarian law, calling for an independent investigation. The rules are clear, but the reality on the ground tells a very different story, where accountability remains elusive. Delivering humanitarian aid to Gaza has always been fraught with obstacles. In peacetime, restrictions and bureaucracy slowed shipments to a crawl. Now, in wartime, the risks have increased exponentially. Recent changes have funneled most aid through the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a new organization managed jointly by Israel and the United States. This foundation operates only a handful of guarded distribution sites, all closely monitored by Israeli forces. The stated aim is to prevent aid from being diverted to Hamas fighters, a concern grounded in past incidents. But for ordinary people, this system has become a deadly bottleneck. Thousands gather for hours, pressed together in hope and desperation, vying for a single bag of flour or a meager parcel of food. The process is chaotic and dangerous. According to local authorities, hundreds have died in just the past 3 weeks while trying to reach these distribution centers. Eyewitnesses from the recent Khan Younis attack describe scenes of pandemonium. All of a sudden, they let us move forward and everyone bunched together. Then the shells began to fall, tank shells. No one is showing mercy. People are being torn apart just for a chance to feed their children. The injuries are devastating. Medics report shrapnel wounds, terrible burns, and crush injuries from stampedes. Hospitals, already crippled by months of bombardment and supply shortages, are swamped beyond capacity. Wounded victims spill onto floors and into corridors, often arriving in civilian vehicles, rickshaws, or donkey carts, as ambulances are too few and often unable to reach the scenes of violence. Medical staff work around the clock, improvising with dwindling medical supplies. The International Committee of the Red Cross has described the situation as dire and resources are stretched to the very limit. These tragedies are not isolated. In Rafah, another city in southern Gaza, at least 23 people were killed by Israeli gunfire while seeking aid just days ago. Across the Gaza Strip, almost every attempt to distribute humanitarian supplies is shadowed by violence, confusion, and fear. The United Nations, with decades of experience in conflict zones from Bosnia to South Sudan, has publicly condemned the new aid system as not only inadequate, but also a violation of the core humanitarian principle of impartiality. Why has the system become so perilous? Israel insists that strict controls are necessary to prevent aid from bolstering Hamas fighters, citing past incidents where resources were seized for military use. The United States and other allies support these precautions, fearing that unchecked aid flows could prolong the conflict or empower extremist groups. Yet, humanitarian organizations warn that these restrictions are, in effect, punishing an entire civilian population, a practice forbidden by international law and widely viewed as morally indefensible. The statistics are staggering. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation claims to have distributed more than 3 million meals at just 4 distribution sites. But the need is far, far greater. According to United Nations estimates, the population's requirements outstrip current supplies by at least tenfold. Jens Laerke, spokesperson for the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, warns, "The suspension of aid deliveries will have a devastating impact on the already vulnerable population of Gaza." On the ground, the impact is clear. Bread, for generations a staple of every meal, has become a rare luxury. Families often survive on a single meal a day, sometimes less. Malnutrition is rising at an alarming rate, especially among children. The World Food Program has issued dire warnings. Without urgent intervention, the hunger crisis in Gaza could become one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 21st century. The toll is measured not only in deaths, but in stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and the psychological scars borne by an entire generation. To give some perspective, during the Ethiopian famine of the 1980s, a crisis that shocked the world, millions faced starvation, but an unprecedented global response helped avert the very worst. In Gaza, the world response is hampered by political divisions and logistical barriers that seem insurmountable. So, what comes next? The international community faces a daunting crossroads. There is a growing consensus among diplomats, aid workers, and policy analysts that the current approach is unsustainable. Human rights organizations are demanding an independent investigation into the Khan Younis attack and similar incidents. The International Criminal Court could, in theory, launch a formal probe into alleged war crimes, as it has done previously in conflicts from Darfur to Ukraine. United Nations agencies warn that suspending or even limiting aid deliveries risks pushing Gaza's population over the brink, with consequences that could last for generations. Some diplomats maintain a cautious hope that the sheer scale of recent suffering could force a breakthrough. There are whispers of renewed negotiations, both direct and indirect, between Israeli and Palestinian leaders, sometimes facilitated by regional powers or by European diplomats. Some argue that the growing moral outrage, as seen in mass protests across Europe and North America, may finally pressure both sides and their international backers to pursue a lasting ceasefire. Yet, this optimism is tempered by deep fears. The longer the conflict continues, the greater the risk of regional spillover. Iran, a longtime supporter of Hamas, has already been drawn into direct confrontation with Israel. The potential for wider escalation, potentially involving Lebanon's Hezbollah or even more distant actors, casts a long shadow over the entire region. Unrest is not confined to the Middle East. Across Europe, North America, and beyond, images of Gaza's suffering have sparked massive protests, heated political debates, and urgent calls for action. In major cities from London to New York, demonstrators have taken to the streets, demanding their governments do more to protect civilians and uphold international law. The moral outrage is palpable, but so too is a sense of helplessness. As Miriam Elder of the International Committee of the Red Cross has said, "Our teams are working tirelessly to provide assistance to the wounded, but the situation is dire and resources are stretched to the limit." For viewers around the globe, this is not just a distant tragedy. It is a lesson in the fragility of humanitarian systems and a stark warning about the real costs of political inaction. The Geneva Conventions, cornerstones of international humanitarian law, are only as strong as the world's collective resolve to enforce them. Without accountability, these rules risk becoming little more than empty promises. The consequences of the Gaza crisis extend far beyond the borders of the Strip. When humanitarian aid is disrupted, it sends shockwaves through the global economy. Food prices, already unstable due to climate change, war, and supply chain disruptions, can spike further as aid supplies are cut off. The World Food Program has repeatedly warned that crises like Gaza's can fuel wider food insecurity, spark migration, and even contribute to conflict in faraway countries. From Yemen to Syria, and even as far as the Horn of Africa, we have seen how local crises can quickly morph into global emergencies, affecting trade, migration, and political stability on a massive scale. Looking to the future, several scenarios are possible. In the worst case, we may see a deepening humanitarian tragedy, with even more families risking their lives for scraps of food or medicine. In this scenario, trust in international law and institutions erodes further, and the risk of regional conflict rises. Alternatively, there could be a breakthrough, a truly independent investigation, stronger international pressure, and a new, more effective system for delivering aid directly to those in need. This would require unprecedented cooperation between adversaries and a renewed commitment to the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality that form the bedrock of humanitarian action. There are even deeper implications. If the world fails to protect civilians in Gaza, what message does that send to other conflict zones? From Sudan to Myanmar, from Ukraine to Ethiopia, millions of people depend on the hope that international law will shield them from the worst horrors of war. If that promise is broken in Gaza, it is weakened everywhere. In the words of a survivor from Khan Younis, "If the world will not defend us now, who will defend any of the weak, anywhere?" So, what can be done by governments and by ordinary people watching this unfold? First, public awareness is vital. Sharing verified information, supporting impartial humanitarian organizations, and demanding accountability from elected leaders can all make a difference. History provides powerful examples. Global mobilization helped end apartheid in South Africa, forced intervention in Kosovo, and brought about the Berlin airlift during the Cold War. In each case, public awareness and international outcry changed the course of events. Second, pressure on international institutions is crucial. The United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and regional organizations such as the European Union possess a range of tools: sanctions, formal investigations, and diplomatic leverage. Their effectiveness, however, depends on the collective will of their member states and on sustained public engagement. Without this, even the best frameworks can fail. Third, support for humanitarian organizations is essential. Groups such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and the World Food Program operate in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Their staff risk their lives every day to deliver food, water, and medical aid. Donations, advocacy, and political support help these organizations expand their reach and protect their workers. Fourth, education and dialogue are critical. Understanding the root causes of the Gaza crisis, decades of historical grievances, deep political divisions, and complex regional rivalries can help prevent future atrocities. Schools, universities, and media outlets all have roles to play in fostering informed debate and cultivating empathy across borders. It is also important to recognize the psychological toll of this crisis. Mental health experts warn that the trauma experienced by children who witness violence, displacement, and chronic hunger will have long-lasting effects. Studies from previous conflicts show that untreated trauma can perpetuate cycles of violence and instability, underlining the need for not only physical aid, but also psychosocial support. History offers hope. The Berlin airlift in the late 1940s demonstrated that determined international action can save lives even in the most dire circumstances. The global response to the Ethiopian famine in the 1980s, though imperfect, showed the power of sustained humanitarian commitment. The relief efforts after the Indian Ocean tsunami in the early 2000s united nations and people from every continent in a common cause. Each of these responses began with a crisis, and with the refusal of the world to turn away. Today, the question is whether the international community will step forward or whether the suffering will deepen. The answer, for now, hangs in the balance. But one truth remains clear. The Geneva Conventions and the entire system of humanitarian law are only as effective as the world's will to enforce them. Without real consequences for violations, these rules become empty promises, relics of a more hopeful era. It is up to us to pay attention, to demand action, and to remember that behind every headline is a human story unfolding in real time. If you found this video informative, please share it to help raise awareness. Subscribe for more in-depth analysis on global economics and technology. And let us know in the comments, what more should the world be doing?